Good evening and welcome to Faith with Under Fives, a conference for those engaging with under fives in faith settings, which is spread over 3 evenings. It's great to have you here. This conference is sponsored by the United Reformed Church's Children and Youth Work and Roots for Churches. My name's Sam Richards. I'm the head of Children's and Youth Work for the United Reformed Church, and I'll be your host for this evening, internet connection permitting. So it's wonderful to have so many of you here. I think there are still a few more people just joining us now. And thank you for giving your time and your energy to such an important area of ministry. So tonight, our focus is faith with under fives in wider mixed age groups. Our keynote speaker, I'm delighted that we have with us this evening, Becky May. She's a freelance writer and trainer and one of the contributors to Roots for Churches. And she'll be joined later by a couple of practitioners, Gus Webb and Vicky Pickett-Genge, for a panel discussion. And we will be asking for your questions for that in a bit. Just a reminder that this evening's session is being videoed. Only the speakers will appear in the public version. So please feel free to keep your camera on unless there's a particular reason why you'd like to turn it off, and particularly when you go into small groups. Obviously much friendlier if you've got your camera on, if you're happy to do so. Please feel free to use the chat function for questions, suggestions and sharing resources. We will be gathering material from the chat together and emailing that out to people at the start of next week, along with the link to a recording of this session. So we're going to start this evening. I hope that you have remembered to bring a cuddly toy with you. I have mine here. So if I can ask you to take your cuddly toy, and then we're just going to open with a very simple prayer. So please hold your cuddly toy and think of the little ones that you normally engage with. Hold them as you hold your cuddly toy. Hold them in prayer before God. Entrust them to God's love. Imagine that you are the cuddly toy. And know that you are held in the everlasting arms of God. Thank you, God, for knowing us, for hearing our unspoken prayers, for holding us close. So we are going to begin our evening. We've got hopefully a varied programme for you, and it does include a wriggle break a little bit later. But we're going to begin our evening with a short video with some clips from interviews with a couple of practitioners.
So trying to do that in one group does have its challenges, and particularly with the younger children, when you're having these conversations with the older children about, well, what does God say through this passage, or what does that mean for you, but the very little ones aren't going to join in with that with best will in the world. So have an activity that they can do, make their craft activity a bit longer than you might do an activity with the older children, or have toys in the corner and say it's okay for you to go and play. And in some ways, having those things going on in the same space means that children can transition from one group to the next, as it were, without any sort of difficulties or trauma. So actually, if you're the same team of people are in the same room looking after these children, that you know, there are some advantages, that transition, that trauma, that building new relationships and starting all over again with new people, it doesn't really happen.
What we do as well, we set aside some things. So we've got like a sandpit, for example, so they can just play in the sandpit, or we will try to create something that's still on the same theme of whatever that theme is, whatever the message is for that message church, where they can join in, but join in age appropriate, etc. Whether it's something to play with, something to create, something to do. And we always try to include the children, especially the under fives as well, into whatever playlet we're doing within the main service part itself.
I very rarely ask one question once. I might ask one question 3 ways, almost straight away, so that those who need a differing way of listening, it works. As you can see, I talk with my hands a lot, so I've got a very basic understanding of British Sign Language and Makaton, and so I use that. For example, for those who are fidgety, I tend to give them something to do, perhaps while I'm engaging some of the older ones. Pop in the sports hall to run around and burn off some energy. It helps us to retell the stories differently, maybe, or we do tend to have a worksheety option for those who are that kind of learner. The generations of children that we are now working with love technology. They don't like Zoom, I've discovered, but they do like technology generally. And if you put the tablet on and I choose maybe one of the children to be the page turner or to be the tapper of the questions, you know, and that engages all of them. If you show something on a TV, it doesn't matter the age, adults included, they all sit and watch.
As long as they feel welcome and that they're not doing something wrong, they will still feel that they've learned something or grown in some way. You know, just because they're fiddling with something doesn't mean they're not listening. They're not sitting still doesn't mean they're not listening. And I know that's very, very hard. I've had children who have been absolute handfuls, and I've many times felt they've completely wrecked sessions for other people. But actually, they are just as important, and there's usually a reason why they behave the way they do. We've got to try and learn about that, and you'll get to know your children and what works for them, especially if you've got a small group, and make sure that you've thought about what will this child learn from and grow from. You know, they might join in with something else, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's hit their heart. It might just pass them by as an entertainment activity that was vaguely interesting at the time.
So asking some of the younger children to be my helper, like, oh, I need your help to tell this story. When I say this word, can you say that? You know, and engaging them in that way. And actually that brings them up rather than brings the older ones down. So just encouraging them to be the helper.
It's amazing how many other children take them under their wings anyway. And they normally take them and show them around where to sit, what to do and everything like that. And we've got some 7 or 8 year olds who come to Message Church, and instead of doing the craft activity, they will go and sit and play and teach and learn, or even encourage some of the younger ones that are 3 and 4, be almost like their guardian, be their support. And sometimes they will bring them to the craft table and help them. And that really encourages them. And it's amazing that you see the development of those that are 2, 3, 4 years old. I'm
a big children's worship song lover. And actually the profound simplicity in those is just incredible. You know, and what we allow our young people and children to do is engage in that on whatever level. You know, if you're an 11-year-old boy, jumping around and making a fool of yourself isn't really that appealing. So we do allow them to sit out and not sing. But the idea is, what we always say, you can choose how you worship as long as you don't disrupt the worship of others. That's made a lot of them engage more, which is incredible.
So I hope that's warmed you up to the subject that we're going to be looking at in more detail across this evening. So the plan now is that we'll hear from Becky May in just a moment for the first of 2 input sessions that she's going to give us, and then after each of those we'll have some time in small groups time to reflect on what you've heard, to talk about your own context, your own situations, and hopefully learn from each other as well. So I'm delighted to be handing over to Becky May.
So I have called this first talk that mixed age groups are a blessing and not a curse. And I hope that that resonates with you. I really do. In this first session, we're going to be giving some thought to the background to tonight's theme, why we do our work in mixed age groups, but more particularly why we do things in a particular way and some of the things we need to give attention to when we are working with a mixed age group together. And then later on, we're going to be looking more at how we can put that into practice. So some practical ideas and tips along the way. Now, it might put you off to discover that I'm not an early years specialist. In fact, I probably was the person who would run and hide under a cover when the under fives came along. I was very happy with teenagers. I was very happy with primary age. I was a primary school teacher for a while. But under fives terrified me until I became a mother and I realised that if I was going to do this thing, I really needed to get my head around the first 5 years of their life and not wait for them to reach the age I was comfortable with. So I think I probably invested quite a lot of time into working out what makes under fives tick, because it's not something that came naturally to me. And I hope that that would help you in your work with mixed age groups, because I think we have to recognise that when you get a group of children together, the under fives have very particular needs and things that they relate well to and things that they struggle with. So hopefully we'll explore that a bit today. I hope it hasn't put you off. Okay, so why are we exploring this theme? Well, I think it's quite simply because it's a reality for most of us. You probably won't be surprised to hear that in the 2016 church attendance figures show that on average there were only 9 children per Church of England church. So that's just illustrative, really, of a situation that I think would be true for many of us. And so the less children that you have in your group, the more likely it is that you will have a mixed age group. I have to share a little anecdote here. When I wasn't under 5, I think I was probably about 9. I came out of Sunday school one week and said to my mum, "Mum, I came second in the quiz." And she said, "Becky, there are only 2 of you in your class." And that's perhaps the reality that we lived with for a while, with this idea of banding people into age groups, no matter how small the groups became. Whereas now perhaps the reality for most of us is that we're working with a mixed age group. It doesn't always work well. And we have to be aware of some of the pitfalls. And some of these are probably already familiar to you. I heard some in the video already. Sometimes we plug for the middle group and then we miss out the older ones and we miss out the younger ones. Sometimes we target what we're doing to the older children and the under 5s scramble around on the floor, completely disengaged with whatever's going on. And sometimes we bring the teaching down and we end up losing the older ones' interest. Some of the pitfalls. But I think it can work well. Actually, I think there's real joy in mixed age groups. Now, we have this common understanding that the best model for our work with children, when I was planning this, I was thinking particularly about our Sunday groups, because I think this is the group where we're most likely to have mixed age groups together. And we have that understanding of this model of Sunday school, or whatever we've chosen to call it more recently, where we have a large group of children in small age-banded groups. So we may split it to 5s to 7s. We may have split it even smaller sections than that. And that's certainly been the norm within living memory. But I don't know if you're aware that that's actually quite a recent development. Now, it is beyond living memory. None of us are old enough to remember this being brought in. But it was only at the start of the 20th century when the Sunday school movement was adapted and remodeled and reworked. And there was lots of wisdom that was taken on board from the education system, that children learn best when they are grouped together in particular age bands. That's true to a point, but we're not actually a school educating children. We want to teach them about God. We want to teach them the Bible, but we're more than that. We want to be a place where they can encounter God, a place where they can discover together, a place where they can worship together. And that's not something that's limited by age bands. We do, however, need to let our children grow. We know that children grow physically, they grow emotionally, we know they grow intellectually. I don't know for you if you've spotted some of your children recently, after a while, after the last few months. My nephew seems to have shot up in the time that I haven't seen him. And as much as we're letting them grow physically, we also need to enable them to grow spiritually. And I think this is one of the things we need to be aware of. Now, by nature of the fact that we're here as people who work with mixed age groups, we will be as concerned for our 8, 9, 10-year-olds as we will be for our 3, 4, 5-year-olds. We've come here to look at this particular issue, but we won't favour those children. We'll be aware of all their needs. Now, I want to share something with you that Yvonne Morris, who is the Children and Families Ministry Advisor for the Diocese of Oxford, has been working through. And I have her permission to share this with you this evening. But I want to flag up that I know this is a work in progress, and I have urged her to make this a fuller piece of work that perhaps will end up in a book form. But I'm just going to share a little bit of that with you today. So she starts by calling this a theology that grows, children's understanding of God and children's ability to encounter and make sense of the God stuff grows and develops over time. And she looks at these first building blocks for our under fives. So these are truths that an under 5 needs to know. God made me. God knows me. God loves me. I can know and love God. Now, they're both incredibly simple and deeply profound. And I do a lot of my work with unchurched children and adults. I'm involved as a messy church leader. And I find a lot of older children who've never discovered those truths. But if we're thinking about children who are growing up perhaps in a church environment, they are the first step right there. Now, beyond that, she goes into older children, thinking about things like God is part of my story and I'm part of God's story. Beyond that too, I'm testing things I thought when I was younger and I'm leaving some of them behind. Now, I wonder what else you'll add to that and what you think your children need as they grow. But I think that's something we really need to be aware of in mixed age groups, that actually we're very aware of what our very small children need. And we're also looking for opportunities for our older children to grow. Finally, from now, I want to share with you something that some of you may already be familiar with, particularly if you use the Roots resources. This was something that really spoke to my heart when I found it, and it's the work on spiritual style. For those of you who haven't come across this, it's the same as the idea that we have different learning preferences, that we have different ways that we connect with our intellectually. There are also different ways that we connect with God, and you can find out more about this on the spiritual on the Roots in the website. Sorry, if you just search for spiritual styles, there's so much good stuff there, and there's a couple of handouts, particularly about under 5s and also mixed age groups. It's really helpful. But the reason why I flagged this up is that and it did come through the stories on the video earlier, that sometimes a 4-year-old in our group will have more in common with a 7 or 8-year-old in our group than perhaps 2 7-year-olds may have. And I think that's really valuable, that actually what we do is present to children opportunities to connect to God in different ways. Time has whizzed away. I hope that's a helpful starting point for us as we move through this evening.
Thank you very much, Becky. That's fantastic to get us going in thinking more deeply about faith with under 5s in mixed age group settings. So we're going to be sending you into small groups, POS groups, in just a few moments, and you have couple of tasks. The first thing obviously is to introduce yourselves to each other, and you will be in the same group again a little bit later, so you'll get to spend a bit more time together, and then we're asking each group, obviously as you reflect on what you've heard so far and chew it over in relation to your own work, to together frame one question for our discussion panel, and then towards the end of the time you're going to have 10 minutes in your small group, make sure you've chosen one person who can share that question as soon as you come back by typing it into the chat for us. When you come back, there's going to be a 10-minute sort of wriggle break. There'll be some slides up just telling you about some resources and information and so forth, but feel free to stand up, stretch, grab yourself a drink or something at that point if you want to, but please make sure that your question's been typed into the chat so that when we reconvene at 7:35, all being well, we'll be able to start answering your questions. So we're going to send you into small groups now. Hello. I hope that people are back from their wriggle breaks, and thank you very much for all your questions, very stimulating questions. Unfortunately, we won't have time to answer them all now, but we will try and summarise all the questions in the resource that we send out to you after the event at the start of next week. So I'm delighted to be joined now by Becky May and Gus Webb and Vicky Piggott-Genge, who are going to form the panel, who are going to have a go at tackling some of the challenging questions that you have put to us. So the first question I'm going to put to Becky first is how might you help to build relationships amongst a mixed age group of children if this is the only time, in fact, this group are together? They might be coming perhaps from different schools or different parts of the city, that sort of thing.
Okay, I think there are a couple of things we can do here, and I think the first thing is to be intentional in creating space for socialising. So sometimes we get the children together and we have such a short amount of time, and we jump straight in with the story, and then we've got to do the activity, and then we're going to pray together, and then quick, we're out of time. And maybe what we need to do is to create a space for them to build relationships. And I'm particularly mindful at the moment that children will not have been meeting in this way anyway. So even if they knew each other really well beforehand, I think we may need to be quite deliberate when we come out of this current situation to giving children space to build relationships. So things like an extended time for refreshment and chatting, or games where we open up a bit more to each other. In an ideal world, in my experience, was that when you go to church, the time after church is that time when you all play together. And my children, my husband preaches in a number of churches, and my children are always making new best friends when they go to church. They are their new best friends. But sometimes that doesn't happen. And perhaps if we're finding that our groups aren't gelling together, then maybe we need some time to release ourselves from the program of teaching and build that relationship. It might be deliberate team building type games, or it might just be as simple as let's sit down and have a chat for a bit longer together.
That's great, thank you. Gus, I'm going to come to you next with the question of are children missing out if they're in a mixed age group as opposed to when they're in a peer group? What are your thoughts on that one?
Well, from my experience, in short, the answer is no, they don't miss out. When you mix the age groups, if you're talking about children that are very young, 2, 3, 4 years old, and they're mixing with 7, 8 year olds or even slightly older, they certainly don't miss out. If anything, it brings them on in life. I always recall my youngest son, who's now currently 8, but when he was 3, 4 years old, he was certainly brought on by the children that were older around him. Within our Message Church, for example, he was one of the youngest of 2, and all the other children were certainly much older, but being in that sort of environment has certainly brought him on in his knowledge, his strength, his faith, his spirituality as well. I certainly think as well that mixing those age groups is very strong for those that are slightly older, the 6, 7, 8-year-olds, because they have a sense of responsibility to bring along those who are younger. As I said in the VT that was played earlier, the slightly older child tends to bring along the younger child and give them that clear sense of responsibility, building a relationship and making them feel accepted as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Gus. So, Vicky, I'm going to come to you now and ask, we had a question about how to provide spiritual nourishment and support for the leaders who are running these groups and perhaps missing out on the main service. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, actually, this is something I chose that question because it's something I'm really passionate about. So one of the things that I make sure of is that when I'm doing rotas, because I'm a paid youth and children's pastor, so that's my job. So when I'm organising rotas, I always make sure that my leaders, where possible, and it's not always possible because we're a bit understaffed sometimes like everybody else, but where possible, there's at least one a half term or one a month, ideally, where they aren't on anything. And I make sure that they're also not serving on any other rotas that Sunday. So they're not doing refreshments, they're not welcoming, they are completely off somewhere so that they have the opportunity to be in church for themselves. I'm also regularly checking in on them with emails, or I send stuff to them. We have when we have our team meetings, it always starts with some kind of devotional and worship. I am really passionate that we don't burn out our leaders. I'm very, very passionate. And if I feel that our rotas are getting stretched to the point where that looks as though it's an issue, I nearly always will go to our leadership with that and say, we need to do something. Either we need an all age service, or we need other people to volunteer for one Sunday so that they're not volunteering. One of the things my church put into practice a few years ago was that for the whole of August, there is no children's and young people's work that goes out. We provide a whole pack of things and we put tables at the back of church for parents to sit with their children and young people. But that the idea is that that's a whole month off for everybody who's usually volunteering, because the last thing you want is someone who is burnt out and wants to walk away from church because they've just had enough. So, but yeah, regular check-ins, emails, phone calls, anything I can really, just to make sure that they're doing okay.
Okay, thank you for sharing your practice as well as your wisdom on that. So another question we had was on how do we avoid putting our own spin on the spiritual development or faith development of the children that we're working with. And so I'm going to take that and say, I think on the one hand we have to be honest and recognise that there's an extent to which we can't avoid doing that. We inevitably are sharing our faith, we're sharing our traditions, we're sharing our approach to things like prayer and worship, and actually that in a sense that's part of the point. We're inviting children to come and be part of a community of faith, and that community has its own particular style and its particular ways of doing things, and so inevitably we're passing some of that on. We're socializing children into becoming part of the community of faith. However, we can tell if we're doing as good a job as we can in terms of being open and not forcing a particular style or a particular faith content onto our children, by whether they're genuinely able to ask any questions, whether they're able to ask questions that surprise us, whether when we ask a question they give us answers that surprise us, that are not things we would have said, that they're not just parroting back to us what they have heard, but that we're genuinely giving them space to think for themselves, to experience for themselves, to explore for themselves, so that we tell stories and without explaining what the story means, we share experiences of encountering God through whatever our style of worship might be, without necessarily unpacking and saying, oh, that's where God was in that experience for the children we're working for. And we allow them to tell us what they're experiencing, how they're exploring, and we enable them to express faith for themselves. So I would say look out for those surprises. So I'm going to come back to you, Becky, now with a question about how do you integrate the spiritual styles into your work with children across a mixed age range?
Great, thank you. So the work that we looked at previously about spiritual styles flagged up 4 different ways that we connect to God, and we have different preferences. So they were word, emotion, action, and symbol. And I won't go into them in great depth now, but I would encourage you to go and look at the Roots website for those. If you're already using Roots, the great thing about it for older children, the care and smart, I've done my bit. And the great thing about it is that it will flag up to you which of the spiritual styles, the different activities best serve, and there tends to be a breadth. There tries to be a breadth there. If you're planning your own teaching, or if you're making use of another resource, or you're meshing things together, then I would be quite intentional about having those somewhere in your planning, and talk about as you're planning, think about which of the different activities best meets those different needs. So right back at the planning stage, not when you come to delivery, oh my goodness, this child isn't connecting to God today, but actually right back when you're planning, how can I ensure that I'm getting a breadth of coverage of these styles? And the more open-ended activities that we do, Lydia, I'm quiet, I'll come a bit closer, is that better? The more open-ended activities that we do, the better we can serve children of different spiritual styles as well. We can give more opportunities for more children to engage with that.
Lovely, thank you, Becky, and apologies if that was a little difficult to hear. It's yeah, as I'm sure you're aware, these things are sometimes not quite perfect. So Gus, I have another question for you, which was what 5 things would you always have in your kit, your resources for working with a mixed age group?
I could actually go down the simple option and just say paper, pen, colour felt tips, and rubber, ruler, and things like that. But I'm not going to say that at all. What I'm going to say is definitely have in the 5 things that I would have are coloured ribbon, so minimum of colours. And if you Google do with ribbon, you'll be amazed at the things that you can actually do, the stories you can tell, Bible stories that you could tell by just having 4 or 5 coloured ribbons, etc. And try to have enough for as many children as you've got. I'd without a doubt say that Play-Doh, if Play-Doh is not affordable, try salt dough, but obviously you need to be careful, especially working with the younger children, that they're not putting it into the mouths, etc. But the interactive nature of salt dough, Play-Doh, the creativity that you can do with that is unbelievable, especially around Bible stories, as I say. I'd certainly have a soft ball for just to break out into some fun time, just in case it's getting a bit messy and getting a bit noisy, etc. So have a soft ball and a few games up your sleeve with a soft ball, so that you could just break out, just burn a little bit of energy, and then bring them back to the table if need be. Also have a play shoot. If you've not discovered a play shoot before, or a parachute, as some people would call them, they are well worth investing in, especially to form a circle. Look up some play shoot games, and easily found on the internet, and these will keep children entertained. And finally, last but not least, I definitely have a cuddly toy. So without a doubt, have a cuddly toy. Or if you're skilled enough, have a cuddly toy. If you puppet a cuddly toy, and you can you can use it adequately, or then that will make a massive difference as well.
That's brilliant, thank you. I was instantly reminded of those times when you can throw a play shoot up and all sit down underneath it and create a little sacred space with children, and just how precious that can be. And finally, Vicky, just a quick question about how do we make sure that we're engaging boys as well as girls?
Yeah, it's funny because you said about the play sheet, and I'm like, that just has, we've got one and we use it, but it has so many ways to go wrong once active boys are involved. But actually, funny enough, that is one of the main things, isn't it? Particularly with boys, is I try to do as many active things as possible, well, depending on your boys. So what I would say is that we have this very gender specific boys versus girls, but what I would say is it's much more important to understand your children and young people, because you've got some girls that will be more boyish and some more boys that will be more sensitive and don't want to do the heavy sports thing. So it's much more important to get a rounded idea of who your children are and respond to that. So for the more active ones, I always try and not just tell the story, but work out a way to do the story. So in whatever way. So we've done the walls of Jericho, marching around a giant Jenga tower, you know, and things like that. We've done, this sounds awful, we've done the stoning of Stephen by throwing balls at a wall. You know, it's all kind of like we try to be the story, do the story as well as tell it. But what I would say is I always try to have 3 or 4 different things at, like, so a bit like Gus's, you know, toolkit in that sense, of things that are going to link in some way to be able to engage everyone. So for those who are more quiet and want to read and listen and do questions, there is a kind of more worksheety based one, but at the same time we also try and do something that is active. And for those children who hate running around the sports hall, we're very blessed with the sports hall, so for those who don't want to do that, they are able to sit and watch and be judges for the game or whatever else it is. But what I try to do is do the more active things at the beginning, and then hopefully they're a little bit more worn out to be able to sit and do and listen. But one of the best things that I've ever invested in is a box of Lego, because it doesn't matter who they are and whatever it's doing. You know, if you say we're going to create, we're going to build with Lego, it doesn't matter what your Bible story is, Lego will work. And that is an absolute game changer for who's going to engage, because they all will 100%.
That's brilliant. And obviously Duplo, or the simpler versions of
yeah, absolutely, or Mega Blocks. I have to say, I say Lego, but actually ours is what they call fake Lego, because it's actually Mega Blocks, because it's so much cheaper.
Great. So I'm sorry we weren't able to tackle more of your questions, and we will try and do some of that on the resources we send out afterwards. But I'm now going to hand back over to Becky May, who has another bit of prepared input to share some more of her wisdom with us.
So earlier we were looking at why we're looking at this subject and perhaps why we do things in a particular way. And already in those discussions we've just had, we've talked about some of the things we can do, how we can answer this how question. How do we do this? And I want to share some principles that we can apply, because obviously we haven't got time to deal with everybody's particular situation. And that's very much the case, that all of us bring our own experiences to this, our own context. We all have different ways of doing things because of our own preferences. The makeup of our groups will all be different. And so some of us will have very broad age range, perhaps one child in every age bracket. Others will have a couple of under 5s and a lot that are at the other end of the group. It's also true that our groups will change over time. And it will be interesting to see when we come out of this season what the makeup of our groups are. And I think we need to press pause before we pick up where we dropped off, and think about reshaping our group, mindful of where they've been the last little while, what experiences they've had, and what their makeup, their preferences are now. So I really want to not try and address everybody's individual situation now, but rather to highlight some principles that we can all consider in our own context and how we apply those to ourselves. So some questions that's helpful to think about as we do this. Now, I would suggest that it's actually really hard to keep a mixed age group all together all the time. And I think this has been said at other times already this evening. Now, you may well be in the same space. It may well be that you've got a couple of adults with this mixed group in one room, but actually it's very hard to keep your under fives engaged with your older children for the duration of the time that you're running your activity. Anyway, here's some questions for you to think about. When in your session will you gather together? Perhaps it will work well for your group to share the story together. Or perhaps it will work well to pray together. Perhaps it's the refreshments time. We've talked about that need for social interaction between the group. So perhaps that's the best time. And I'd ask you to think about when are the best times for your children to be together, to learn from each other, and to share this experience together. And that will be different for everybody who's engaged with this evening. Another question to consider. Would it work to offer some of the activities simultaneously? Now, quite often we have our group and we start at the beginning. Perhaps we start with refreshments and then we tell the story and then we do the activity and then we pray and perhaps we have an action song and off we all go. And what I want to suggest is that sometimes it might work better to offer some activities at the same time. Now, again, we've talked about different preferences. When I was teaching, when I discovered this way of working, that you could have a choice of things out, this was a revelation to me and I loved it. And I tried to share it with colleagues who were absolutely mortified and it didn't work for them. So what I'm not doing here is saying this is the way to do it. I'm flagging up this is a way to consider and see whether this helps your group. But this also gives space for the idea that we can let children encounter God in different ways using those spiritual styles. It gives space to think about having those very simple pieces of equipment, open-ended, free choice, the Lego table or the Duplo, the drawing, whatever it is, simple. It doesn't necessarily mean we've got to plan, photocopy, print, cut out 19 different activities to be done at the same time, but that we give children a choice over what they do at that time. And within that, you will have the child who whizzes around every activity in, 5 seconds flat, and you will have the child who meticulously sits for the duration. So that's one way I'd like to suggest that we offer things a bit differently. It also frees you up, perhaps, so that you can have conversations at a more one-to-one level with children in your group. So you can talk to the very young children at their level, and you can talk to the much older children about the things that they're accessing during the session. Alternatively, if you do prefer to run the group sequentially, then I would suggest that you might like to set out some play materials that are available throughout your whole session. So I know in the Roots materials there are suggestions of play things you can leave out there that relate to the theme, but it could just be a simple basket with some props that can be played with by a child that retell the story. I have a pet hate when we visit other churches of my children being handed the Thomas the Tank Engine colouring book. It is to me the ultimate bugbear because I want my children to be able to engage with what's going on. And when we're thinking about our under fives, we want them to be able to engage with what's going on at their level. So perhaps for our under fives, the thing that they may want, may need, is a simple basket of toys that relate to the story and they can play with at their level while the story washes over them. Now, whatever story resources we're using, we need to look at everything we have available to us and pick the best thing for our group. What we can't be doing is telling the story in 3 different ways. Okay, we're not trying to replicate the model where we have streamed age brackets. We've got to pick the bits that work best for our group. So whatever resources you're using, I would encourage you to look at everything you have available to you and make the choice about which story best suits your children. So here is, just to illustrate here, I'm showing you some of the resources from Roots, and I'm not expecting you to be able to read the tiny print there, but I'm just showing you that we have this script that's written for the older children together with a way of telling it. We also have a more simple way of telling the story for younger children. And you may look at both of those and think, oh, actually, my group would really love dressing up. They'd all love to have headdresses on. That would work fantastically. Or you may think, oh, my children hate dressing up. We could all sit round in a circle and tell the story this way. And however we're choosing to do that, being mindful of the different age groups we've got, we can tell the story in a very, very simple form, like we've talked about earlier this evening. Simple messaging with deep, profound truths. And then perhaps we might want to extend just slightly for our older children, maybe ask a direct question or an open-ended, wondering question that they can all engage with at their own level. Maybe we might have a little bit of extra information. Oh, did you know that this part of the story connects to this thing we did last month? Those little extras that we can add in that manage to hold us all together in that. Now, finally for now, we've talked a lot tonight about normal life, and we're all craving that, I know, desperately. But I think it's also really helpful for us to be mindful of present circumstances. Zoom screen fatigue is very real. I hope you're not feeling it tonight. You're all doing really well. Screen fatigue is really great, and particularly, not great, it's really big. And it's particularly true of our under fives. Ask any parent of a 3-year-old how they're getting on engaging with church at the moment, and you're likely to get the same response. So I think for our under fives, we need to be very mindful of this and whatever we're providing as a church. And it may be a phone call to a parent just to reassure them that their child is not the only child who struggles to engage online. That might really speak to their heart. It might be that you can offer some practical advice if you're working with your church leadership. You know, this Sunday we're putting out a service and this is the story we're using. Maybe you can include a line about, oh, do you know what? Your child might really appreciate having this story basket with these things that they can use in there. And although we're not meeting in mixed age groups at the moment, our children inevitably are meeting in mixed age groups because they're in their family groups. So this is a time where they're going to be learning from each other, worshipping together, encountering God together. So I would certainly see our role at the moment very much as taking the pressure off parents and lowering expectations, or making expectations more realistic in terms of practical, but opening our eyes to the possibilities of what God can do and how God can speak to our children's hearts right now. I've also just flagged up there for you something which I think Claire is going to share a link with you, something that Roots is making available that you can share with your own families, and they make use of resources that were written originally for under fives, but again have worked on this family scale, and I'd encourage you to have a look at those. And they're a quick win. You can go away, print them off, and get them out to your families. I hope that helps. I hope that that's given you some principles to think about rather than here's the answer, this is how to do it. I would just encourage you to take some time to reflect on your own circumstance and what situation you're in right now, and what are the key principles that you need to apply there.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Becky, for that input. So as Becky said, we're now going to give you all a chance to go back to your small groups and to spend some time thinking firstly about what you can take from this evening into your ministry with under fives, what you can take back into your own context, and then a little bit more hopeful for the future to think, what's your dream and what changes would you hope to make in 2021 when the world is perhaps a little bit more back to normal. So we're going to give you about 15 minutes now in your small groups, and then we'll come back to.
Well, welcome back everyone. I hope you had some good conversations in your breakout rooms. You'll have heard lots this evening about Roots. Some of you will be familiar with Roots and some of you may already be subscribers. One of the things you'll have heard from Becky is about our Advent sheets, which are available for families to use at home and are based on our resources for under fives. So these, along with lots of other information and resources from Roots, will be available to you, and you'll have a follow-up email to find our webpage where you can have access to all those resources and much more. So before we finish tonight, I just wanted to talk to you to highlight some elements from the Roots resources, specifically for working with those mixed age groups that we've been so focused on this evening. So they are all going to be taken from our new published resources for January and February next year. So even those of you who are familiar with Roots, you might not be so familiar with the new format that you're going to see in just a moment. So each week within the Roots resources, there are those specifically written for under fives. These Roots resources for very young children can be found on the third page of the weekly materials, and they're all clearly indicated by a teddy bear icon. There's a version of the story for very young children, activities to play and create, a prayer activity, and some specific song suggestions for under fives. The children's session is presented on the first 2 pages of each set of weekly materials. This is designed for ages 5 to 11, but includes many ideas which are adaptable for younger children. Within the children's session, we always include 2 songs with new words written to familiar tunes. The first of these can be found in the Gather section as a way to introduce the session. The second is found within Go With God as the group are sent out. We also highlight activities within the children's material which are suitable for very young children. The gathering and leaving songs, which you've just seen there, are perfect for under fives and can help to bring them into the session at the beginning and gather everyone together at the end. The version of the story for very young children is also really great for children of all ages. And as Becky says, maybe one of the key points when the group might come together, even if children end up doing differentiated activities in between. These ways of sharing the word either use signs, actions, a story scene, a story bag, symbolic objects, or puppets. The Root stories use key storytelling methods which work really well for under fives, repetition, simple language, and they're really creative, engaging ways to tell the Bible story. At the beginning of the children's session, Becky mentioned we offer some support for leaders to prepare their session, and this includes a suggestion of how to offer provision for under fives. So here you'll find a suggestion for play materials to offer for very young children throughout the session. So these are just a few ways that the Roots resources can be accessed and used to provide for under fives when you're working with mixed age groups. You'll find lots more information on the Roots resources on the webpage, which you'll be directed to following tonight's event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. So we're coming to the end of our time together. Richard Knott, who's the Children and Youth Development Officer for the West Midlands Synod, is going to lead us in a few moments of worship and reflection together, and then I'll say a few thank yous, and that will be it. So Richard, over to you.
Hi everyone. Well, we've had a lot to think about, and in our heads and also our hearts are feeling a little bit full after all that we have received and shared in together. So perhaps it would be good to just take a few moments now to be still and to be silent together, and to recenter ourselves and to acknowledge the presence of God with us. we each brought a cuddly toy with us this evening, and this is my offering. It's actually a doorstop. I have to make that confession to you. But I wonder if your cuddly toy has a name. I wonder if the name was one that you chose or one that was given by someone else. I wonder how you feel about your own name. Is this one you've chosen or one that was given by someone else? And if you know if your name has a particular meaning. Names can be really important. Some people do choose to change, or they prefer to use perhaps a middle name or an abbreviation. And some people really object to having their name abbreviated. Names are sometimes passed on in families by tradition from one generation to the next. I've been thinking about the importance of names recently, and those of us who work with children and young people might know something of the importance of using their names. Or perhaps you like going to Starbucks and thinking up a different or unusual name for the barista to spell. This is a game that I know some young people like to play. In biblical times, names carried with them particular meanings. In the Old Testament, we see, for example, a baby being called Laughter or Isaac in their language because of the particular circumstances of its birth. During Advent, I'll be using the names of Jesus Advent calendar as a bit of a focus, and some pictures of that might come up on the screen to let you see now. And each day, I'll see a reminder of a different name that's used for Jesus. And one of them that you'll see on the next image is referred to initially in the book of Isaiah. And we see this prophecy referred to in Matthew's Gospel as one of the names used for Jesus, which is Emmanuel, which means God with us. Perhaps this year in particular, which has held so many difficulties for us, both personally and collectively, that we really need that reminder that God is with us. The incarnation of God in the form of a tiny infant is an amazing and central idea, that in Christ that we would not be alone, that we would know that God is with us. So this Christmas, let us celebrate that incarnation and celebrate the truth that it represents, that in every circumstance and in every situation, God is with us. Great God, I thank for this time together and for all that we have shared. I pray that each one of us might know in this way that truth that you are with us in our own lives and in the lives of those children, people and the families that we know, that we've been thinking about this evening and who we seek to serve. May we in some way help them to see it and know it in an increased way too. I pray all this in the precious name of Jesus. Amen.
Thank you, Richard. So it's really just down for me to say, look forward to seeing those of you who are rejoining us tomorrow for Faith with Under Fives in church worship, where we'll be thinking about Crash and Pew, and Jill Ambrose will be our keynote speaker tomorrow. And then on Thursday, we're looking at Faith with Under Fives in toddler groups with Alison Hulse. And we will be sending out a link to the videos of all of the sessions and all the resources that have been talked about, and hopefully answers to many of the questions that you asked that we didn't manage to fit in to talk about this evening at the start of the following week, when all those videos will be available on our YouTube channel for you. So it just remains for me to say a huge thank you to all our contributors. So on behalf of children's work, children and youth from the United Reformed Church and Roots for Churches, I want to say thank you to Becky May, our keynote speaker, to Gus Webb and Vicky Piggott-Genge for contributing to the panel, Rosie Nixon and Claire Williams at Roots for Churches, the United Reformed Church Sido Plus team, and in particular Richard Knott, who just led worship for us, Lorraine Webb, Heather Wilkinson and AJ Mills, who's been heading up the technical support. thank you so much for giving up your time to be part of this evening. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and may God go with you. Amen.